The morning she drove the first stake into that hillside, I was leaning against the fence post at the top of my east field drinking coffee from a thermos that had belonged to my father. It was the third week of October 2009, a Tuesday. Cold enough that my breath came out in small white puffs that disappeared before they reached the wire. I had been standing there for 20 minutes before I saw her. The light was still flat and gray, that particular shade of early morning that makes everything look like it has not yet decided what it is. And there, moving across the face of the hillside that ran along the south edge of Callaway Creek, was a small white cone of light, a headlamp, moving in a straight horizontal line from one end of the slope to the other, then stepping up perhaps 18 inches and beginning again. Steady, deliberate, like something mechanical, except that mechanical things do not adjust their pace when the ground changes angle under them. I stood there watching it for a while without fully understanding what I was looking at. When the sky finally lightened enough to make out the shape behind the light, I could see it was a woman. She was working a dibble bar, one of those old iron ones with a T-handle worn smooth from use, driving it into the ground and pulling it out and moving on. She was not a large woman, but she had a way of working that I recognized without being able to name it at the time. No wasted motion, no looking up to see who was watching, no adjusting of the plan. There was something in that which made me stay at the fence longer than I had intended. I had a piece of paper in my coat pocket that morning, folded into thirds. It had been in that pocket for 3 weeks. It was a letter from a company called Agricor Partners out of Columbus, offering me $280,000 for the 160 acres of flat ground I had been farming since I took it over from my father in 1989. The letter used words like managed farmland investment and optimized yield protocols and 5-year partnership structure. The man who wrote it was named Marcus Webb, and he had called me twice already. I had not called him back. I had not thrown the letter away either. Part of why I had come out to stand at that fence post before the sun was fully up was to look at my own land and try to decide something. That was the reason, I told myself anyway. I was 62 years old, and my wife Marion had been gone 4 years, and my son-in-law thought I should think seriously about the offer. The land had been in my family for 3 generations. My father had walked every foot of it with a soil probe and a composition notebook before he ever put a spade in the ground. He had known this land the way you know a person you have worked beside for 40 years. I was looking at my land and thinking about all of that when the headlamp appeared on the hillside across the creek. The hillside in question belonged to a 41-acre parcel that had changed hands the previous September. The county assessor's office had been listing it as non-productive agricultural land for the better part of a decade. Before that, it had been logged by a timber company in 1987, which left the soil compacted and the slope bare and the creek bank unstable for years afterward. Someone had tried winter wheat there in 1997 and given up by May. Before that, another family had put in a small apple orchard. 3 of those trees were still standing when the new owner took possession, gray and limbless, looking like fence posts with ambitions. The hillside ran at roughly 40 degrees on its steepest section, clay subsoil, shale ledge about 18 inches down in places, the kind of ground that discourages optimism. And yet here was a woman with a headlamp working it in the dark before first light, driving holes into soil that had not seen a crop in 11 years, moving in lines so straight and deliberate that she might have mapped the whole face of that hill in her mind before she set foot on it. I poured the last of my coffee and went inside. That evening, Lowell Mabry called me. Lowell farmed the parcel north of mine, corn, and beans on flat ground, same as his father before him and his grandfather before that. He was 55 that year, a solid man who had spent his life doing things the way they had always been done, because the way they had always been done had worked. He was not a cruel man, but he had a very limited tolerance for what he called eccentricity, and anyone who deviated from the established methods of agriculture in Monroe County, Ohio, qualified. He had driven past on the county road that morning and slowed down long enough to see the woman on the slope. He said he had been trying to think of a polite way to say what he was thinking and had decided there was not one. I asked him what he was thinking. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She is going to work herself half to death on ground that does not want to grow anything." I looked out my kitchen window toward the hillside, though I could not see it from there. Marion had grown hardneck garlic in the kitchen garden for 20 years. She used to say that garlic needed a winter underground to know what it was going to become. I thought about that while Lowell waited for me to respond. I did not tell him what I was thinking. I just said I did not know much about the new owner yet and left it at that. But I did know one thing that Lowell did not, because I had made a phone call that afternoon to a man I knew at the county extension office. The new owner's name was Blythe Harwick. She had come from Burlington, Vermont. Her last listed occupation on state tax records was soil technician. She had purchased the 41 acres not at the asking price of $18,500, but at $12,000. Even after presenting the seller with 4 specific reasons why the land was not worth the asking price, each reason cited from documentation in the county assessor's own files. Lowell thought she was a woman who did not know what she was doing. I was starting to think she was something else entirely. The history of the Callaway Creek hillside was not encouraging, and Lowell was not wrong to know it. 2 families before my time had attempted to work that slope, and both had quit. One planted a small apple orchard that lasted 4 years before drainage problems killed it off in a wet spring. The other terraced the upper section for corn put in one season and never came back. The terracing was still there, built properly enough to outlast the ambition that made it. And every time I looked at it, I thought about what it means to do good work on a wrong idea. But that terracing also meant something else. Something I had always noticed without knowing what to do with somebody, had once looked at that slope and seen possibility. They had been wrong about the specific application, but the instinct to look at difficult ground and ask whether the difficulty was actually in the ground or somewhere else that was not nothing. Lowell could not see the difference between those two things. I was not certain I could either, not fully. But standing at that fence post, watching the headlamp move in those steady horizontal lines, I had felt something that Lowell's phone call could not explain away. She had been there before I was up. I was up at 5:15 most mornings. Old habit, the kind that gets into your bones after 40 years of milking schedules. And when I walked out to my equipment shed that morning, at 5:45, her truck was already parked on the gravel pull-off below the hillside. A 1994 Dodge Ram in dark green with a cracked left taillight. She had been there in the dark on a slope she had owned for less than a month, working a grid pattern she had clearly laid out in her head before she arrived. That was not the behavior of someone trying their luck. The next afternoon, I walked down to the fence line. My official reason was a T-post driver I had left leaning against the corner post the week before and genuinely needed back. That was the reason I gave myself anyway. I got to within 30 feet of her before she looked up, and when she did not startle. She just looked at me the way a person looks at something they already accounted for. I said I was her neighbor to the east. She said she knew. I asked her what she was planting. She said hardneck garlic, music variety, mostly with some German red along the top terrace where the drainage was better. I knew what hardneck garlic was. Marion had grown it for years, but I had never heard of anyone planting it at scale on hillside ground in this county, and I told her so. She asked me what I thought the limiting factor would be for hillside garlic in our zone. I said compaction probably, and the deer. She nodded in a way that told me she already knew both of those answers and had already made decisions about both of them. She said the compaction she had been addressing since late August, working the top 8 inches with a broad fork, she had built herself from a design in a 1974 extension bulletin out of the University of Vermont. As for the deer, she had a plan. I did not ask what the plan was. She did not offer. I picked up the T-post driver, and we talked for another few minutes about the fence line between our properties, which needed work on her side near the lower corner. She said she would get to it before November. She did. I came out one morning and found it done without any announcement. New wire stretched clean and tight. Old staples pulled posts re-driven straight. She had not said a word about it afterward. Standing at that repaired fence later, I stayed longer than I needed to. There is a particular quality to work done well by someone who has no interest in being watched doing it. Marion had that quality. My father had it. It is rarer than you would think. What I also noticed that second morning, the morning after our first conversation, was the notebook. She had it in the outer pocket of her jacket, a rigid cover notebook in dark green, the kind you find in the bin by the register at a county hardware store. She pulled it out 4 or 5 times while she worked, opening it to a specific page without hunting, reading something rather than writing, then closing it and going back to work in one continuous motion. It was not new. The pages she was reading were well before whatever page she might have been currently working on. There were a lot of pages that had already been filled. I noticed this and filed it away without fully understanding why it bothered me. Not in a suspicious way, more the way a thing bothers you when you recognize something in it and cannot quite place from where. 3 days later, Xander Corvin came up my drive. Xander farmed 2 parcels south of mine, 60 years old, and he had the manner of a man who had spent his whole life being right about what would and would not work in Monroe County. He stood on my porch and we both looked toward the hillside for a while without speaking. Then he said what a lot of people in the county were privately thinking, which was that the ground up there was no good, the drainage was wrong, and anything planted on that exposure would burn off by July or drown in April, depending on the year, and that whoever had let that woman buy that piece of hillside had seen her coming. I did not argue with him. He was not wrong about the history of that slope. But history is not the same as explanation, and the two get confused more often than they should. He left, and I stood watching Blythe work for another few minutes. She had pulled the notebook out again and was making a single mark before moving on to the next row. One deliberate line, then she put it away. That notebook was starting to mean something to me that I could not yet articulate. What I found out later from Lottie Mabry, who had heard it directly from Blythe over tea, was the thing that changed how I understood everything I had already observed. Lowell had done some checking around after that first morning, the way Lowell always did, when something new appeared in the county. He had called the county recorder's office, talked to the previous owner's real estate agent, done a general accounting of who this woman was and where she had come from. Her name was Blythe Harwick, 38 years old, originally from a small town in central Vermont, where her mother had kept a kitchen garden and a strong opinion about every piece of ground she ever worked. She had studied soil science informally through her work, which for 9 years had been as a soil technician for an agricultural consulting firm in Burlington. Good job, stable income, the kind of career you build carefully over time. She had left it 18 months before she appeared in Monroe County. What Lowell had found, and what he did not tell me until much later because he had not figured out what to do with it, was that the 41-acre Callaway Creek parcel had first appeared in Blythe's life, not in 2009, but in 2007. It had come across her desk as part of a routine assessment her firm was doing for a client considering land acquisition in the region. The assessment included the Monroe County parcels, and the Callaway Creek hillside had been categorized in the firm's report as non-productive agricultural land with no rehabilitation potential. Blythe had written in the margin of the file, "Does not agree. Hard pan, not bad soil." Her supervisor had crossed it out without discussion. 2 years later, she purchased the land herself. Lowell told me this in October, standing at the fence line between our properties, and I could see from his expression that he was not sure how to read it. He had been interpreting Blythe's presence on that hillside as the act of an outsider who did not know what she was getting into. The margin note in the file, the 2-year wait, the precise negotiation of the purchase price using the county's own documentation as leverage, none of that fit the story he had constructed. He drove away without resolving it. I stood at the fence and thought about what it meant to spend 2 years looking at a piece of paper about a piece of ground carrying a conclusion your employer had crossed out, and then deciding to go find out for yourself. There is a kind of knowing that comes before you can prove anything. My father had it about the tile drainage on our east field. He walked that field for 3 years before he put a spade in it. Neighbors thought he was waiting on money. He was not. He was waiting on certainty, and certainty cost more than money and took longer to earn. I did not know yet where Blythe Harwick had gotten her certainty about that hillside, but I was becoming sure that she had it. The confrontation at the fence came at the end of the first week. Lowell had not let go of whatever was bothering him, and on a Saturday afternoon, he pulled his truck onto the shoulder of the county road at the north edge of the Callaway Creek property and called across the field. I was close enough to hear, though I do not think either of them knew that. Lowell said he had spoken to the man who had tried corn on that slope in 1998 and lost $4,000 in one season. He said 2 families before his time had worked that ground and failed. He said the drainage on that exposure was structurally wrong and that anything planted on it would either drown in a wet spring or bake in a dry summer. He said he was telling her this as a neighbor not to cause trouble. Blythe put the dibble bar down. She walked down the slope to the fence line unhurried and stood 3 feet from Lowell with the wire between them. She said the soil does not have a problem. She did not explain further. She picked up the dibble bar and walked back up the slope. Lowell stood there. He looked at the hillside, Then he looked at where she had been standing. Then he got back in his truck. I watched him drive away, and I thought about what she had said and what she had not said. She had not told him he was wrong. She had not explained her reasoning or defended her plan. She had stated a fact she was certain of, and she had said it without heat or apology, and then she had gone back to work. That is not how people talk when they are hoping they are right. That is how people talk when they already know they are right and are simply waiting for circumstances to catch up with their knowledge. The week ended with the first two terraces finished. I could see from my kitchen window that she had pulled a tarp from somewhere and covered the rows, holding the edges down with flat stones she had collected from the hillside itself. She was back the next morning before the frost lifted, checking the edges, pressing the stones back, where any had shifted overnight. On a Thursday evening, I finally called Marcus Webb at Agricor Partners. He answered on the second ring, efficient and pleasant the way people are when they are waiting for something. I listened to him explain the investment structure again, and I asked him one question. What would Agricor do with the land after the 5-year partnership ended? He said they would optimize for market conditions at that time. I asked him what that meant in plain terms. He said it would depend on the highest and best use assessment at the time of renewal. I thanked him and said I would need more time. After I hung up, I stood at the kitchen window for a long while. I could not see the hillside from there in the dark, but I knew the tarp was out there held down by stones she had chosen from the hillside itself because she had already been paying attention to which rocks had flat bottoms. And I knew she would be there before dawn. I took the Agricor letter out of my coat pocket and put it in the kitchen drawer, the drawer where I kept things I had not yet decided about. I did not throw it away, but I moved it out of my coat, and that meant something, though I could not have told you exactly what. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the chair where Marion used to sit across from me, and I thought about all the things she had known about that kitchen garden that she had never written down anywhere because she had assumed she would always be there to know them. And I thought about the notebook in Blythe Harwick's jacket pocket, all those pages already filled, and the way she handled it without hunting for the right page. And I thought about what kind of person writes things down that carefully before they have even started. The kind of person who understands that what you know is only worth something if it survives the season. She was on the frozen hillside with a wooden ruler in her coat pocket by the first Saturday of December. I know because I saw the light. Not a working light, not the broad beam she used when she was driving holes or spreading tarp. A small light, the kind a person holds low and close to the ground. Moving in short horizontal passes, stopping, holding still for 10 or 15 seconds, then moving again. I was up at 5:30 to check on the older of my two horses, who had been favoring his left foreleg, and when I came back across the yard, I looked toward the creek and saw that light moving along the lower terrace of the Callaway Creek hillside in the dark and the cold. It was 11 degrees that morning, the kind of cold that makes the hinges on barn doors stick. I stood in my yard and watched the light for a while, and then I went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and thought about what kind of person measures frozen ground in the dark in December and why. I did not have an answer yet, but the question had started to feel important. What Blythe was doing, as I found out much later, was exactly what it looked like. She was reading what the ground was writing. She walked the slope every Saturday morning from the first week of November through the end of February, wearing the same canvas coat with the same wooden ruler in the same pocket, and every time she found a crack in the frozen surface, she measured it. Width, orientation, approximate depth where she could probe it with a wire she kept coiled in her other pocket. She recorded each measurement in a black composition notebook separate from the green-covered one with the date and the air temperature at the top of each entry. One entry per visit, 43 visits over 2 winters. There were no dramatic findings, no revelations, just lines in the soil that had not been there in October appearing and deepening and sometimes shifting over the course of the cold months. She was building a picture that could not be built any faster than the seasons would allow, and she understood that, and she did not try to hurry it. Lottie Mabry was the one who told me most of this over time in pieces. Lottie had started going over to visit Blythe in December the first time with a box of Christmas cookies and no intention beyond basic neighborliness. But something happened in that kitchen, that first visit, that Lottie came back from quieter than she had left. And she kept going back after that once a month or so without fanfare and without particularly explaining herself to Lowell. I noticed this because Lowell mentioned it to me one afternoon in January, standing at the gate between our properties. his hands in his jacket pockets and his breath coming out in short, hard bursts, the way it did when something was bothering him that he could not name directly. He said Lottie had been spending time over at the Callaway Creek place, and he was not sure why. I said maybe she was just being neighborly. He said maybe, but the way he said it told me that was not what he thought. I asked him if that was a problem. He looked across toward the hillside, which was covered in snow that morning, the tarp rows just visible as low ridges under the white. I just don't see the point, he said, of getting attached to something that is not going to work out. I thought about telling him what I knew about how she had come to buy that land, the margin note in the company file, the 2-year wait, the way she had used the county's own documentation to negotiate the price down. I thought about telling him that the behavior of a woman who spends 2 winters measuring frost cracks in the dark at 11 degrees is not the behavior of someone who has stumbled into something she does not understand. I did not tell him any of that. Lowell was the kind of man who needed to arrive at conclusions by his own route, and shortcuts did not help him get there any faster. They just made him dig in. What I did tell him, because I thought he could use it, was that my father had walked our east field for 3 full years with a soil probe and a notebook before he decided where to put the drainage tile. Lowell knew that story. He nodded slowly in the way of a man storing information he is not ready to use yet, and then he went back to his side of the gate. The conflict inside the Mabry household was quieter than what Lowell showed me at the fence, but it was real. Lottie told me about it later, not as a complaint, but as a matter of fact. She said Lowell had asked her directly in February what she was doing, going over to visit a woman who was probably going to fail and move on inside of 2 years. Lottie had looked at him and asked when the last time was that he had read anything about his own soil before planting. Lowell had not answered. Lottie had gone out to the garden. I have thought about that exchange many times since. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was the kind of moment that reorganizes a household without anyone saying so out loud. After February, Lowell still thought what he thought, but he stopped saying it to Lottie. The second thing I learned about that winter was that Blythe had already been to the county extension office before I ever saw her on the hillside. I knew Crandall from the extension office the way you know anyone you have dealt with professionally for years. He was competent within his area, which was corn and soybean production, on flat, well-drained ground, and he was genuinely helpful when your question fell within that territory. But he had a habit that a lot of specialists have, which is the habit of treating anything outside his expertise as a problem with the question rather than a gap in his knowledge. Blythe had gone to see him before she bought the land. She had come in with a list of questions about hard pan behavior under freeze-thaw cycles, about root penetration rates in compacted clay at various depths, about historical soil data for the county. Crandall had told me about it afterward, not long after she first appeared on the hillside, and he had told it as a slightly baffling story about a woman who asked unusually specific questions. What he had not told me, and what I heard later from Winona, who had been working the front desk at the extension office since 1978, and had seen everything that came through that door, was what Crandall had told Blythe at the end of that visit. He had told her the hillside ground along Callaway Creek was not suitable for commercial agriculture in any form he was aware of. He had said it politely and with what he believed was genuine helpfulness. Blythe had thanked him, stood up, and left. She had not argued. She had not pushed back. She had simply collected her coat and her bag and walked out to her truck because she had not gone there to be persuaded. She had gone there to find out whether the extension office had documentation she had not yet seen. They did not, as far as she could tell, and so she had used the time she would have spent arguing to drive back to the hillside instead. In February of that first winter, Crandall heard from Winona that Blythe had come back in while he was away at a conference. She had asked about historical soil bulletins for the county, and Winona had brought out a cardboard box from the back storage room that had not been opened in some time. When Crandall found out, he called Blythe. I know this because Lottie heard it from Winona, who had been at the desk when Crandall made the call, and Lottie told me. Crandall told Blythe he was concerned that older technical documents might not reflect current agronomic understanding, and that he wanted to help her calibrate her expectations. He offered to connect her with more current resources. Blythe asked him one question. She asked whether he had ever probed the hard pan depth at any specific location along the Callaway Creek hillside. Crandall was quiet. She asked whether he knew the hard pan depth at any specific location on that property. He was quiet again. She told him she had 56 probe points across the hillside every 4 feet in a grid recorded the previous fall. Then she ended the call. Winona told Lottie that Crandall sat at his desk for a while after that and then went into the storage room and came back with the same cardboard box Blythe had been looking through. He set it on his desk and started reading. I heard all of this at a remove and through intermediaries, which means I heard it imperfectly. But even through the distortion of second-hand accounts, something came through. Clearly, Crandall had not been wrong to be cautious about old documents. He had just been wrong in the particular way that people are wrong when they confuse institutional authority with personal knowledge. He knew what the Extension Office officially thought about that hillside. He did not know what was actually in the ground. Blythe knew what was in the ground. She had spent a season finding out with a steel rod and a pencil and a hand-drawn grid map she had taped inside the front cover of the green notebook. The document she had found in that cardboard box was dated September 1971 and written by a man named Dr. Burnett Quill, who had worked for the State Extension Service from 1954 until he retired in 1983. His name appeared in the header as initials and a last name the way government documents used to print them. He had spent the bulk of his career driving county roads in a pickup with a soil auger in the bed, stopping wherever the land looked like nobody had bothered to understand it. The document described what happens to root systems in clay soil with a compaction layer at depth when those roots are given the right depth of planting and the freeze-thaw cycles of a full Ohio winter to work with. It described fracture lines in hardpan, the way they form parallel to the slope, the way roots find them and spread laterally along those planes rather than being stopped. It described what happens over multiple winters when roots spend those months probing and opening and slowly enlarging what the frost has started. The chart showed root behavior at 6 inches at 8 and at 11. The 11-inch column was where the results changed. The document had been written about soybeans and winter wheat. Garlic was not mentioned once in 42 pages. Clipped to the inside of the cardboard box, Blythe found a short obituary. Dr. Burnett Quill had died in 1987. He was survived by his wife and 2 daughters. He had been a longtime member of a Methodist church in Hardin, Ohio. The obituary was 4 sentences long. Blythe photocopied 4 pages of the document on a machine that charged 15 cents per copy. She tucked the copies inside the back cover of the green notebook behind the pages her mother had written and drove home. Winona had said something to her on the way out quietly, the way people say things they have been holding for a while. She said Dr. Quill used to stop at the extension office sometimes when he was doing field work in the county, that he would come in for coffee and talk about the places he had been looking at, that he used to say he wrote his reports for the farmers who would never meet him because he figured most of the people who read them were going through something hard and a diagram might be the difference. Blythe had stood at the door with her hand on the frame and listened to that. Then she had thanked Winona and gone to her truck. I was not there for any of this. I am piecing it together from what Lottie told me and from what Blythe herself told me later on the porch in October with the notebook open between us. But I have thought about that moment in the extension office doorway more than almost any other moment in this story because of what it must have meant to her. Dr. Quill had spent his career studying soils that other people had given up on. He had written a 42-page document about root behavior in hardpan clay, and he had never once mentioned the specific crop that a woman in Monroe County would use 38 years later to test his conclusions on a hillside he had probably never visited. He had written it anyway for whoever needed it because the principle was the principle regardless of the crop. That is a particular kind of faith, not religious faith. The faith that says, I understand something true about the world, and I will write it down carefully, and somewhere down the line it will find the person who needs it. It found Blythe Harwick in a cardboard box in a back room. She spent 2 winters with that document before she used it. The first winter she had already spent watching measuring recording. The second winter was when she went looking for the explanation for what she had observed. She did not find the Quill document and immediately planned accordingly. She found it in February and spent the rest of that winter reading it alongside her own field notes, cross-referencing the frost crack measurements she had taken against the diagrams of fracture plane behavior, building a case in her own mind that she would not consider closed until the evidence was sufficient. She told me later on the porch that she had sat with the document for 2 full winters before she believed it enough to act on it differently than every standard guide told her to. I asked her what 2 winters of sitting with something looked like. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said it looked like measuring, like going back to the same places on the hillside on the same cold Saturday mornings and seeing whether what the document predicted was actually happening in the ground in front of her. Like the difference between a thing that sounds true and a thing you have seen be true with your own hands. The first spring, April 2010, I was walking the fence line when I saw her sitting on a flat stone near the middle terrace with the green notebook open on her knee. She was not measuring anything. She was reading. I got close enough to see that the pages she was reading were not in her own handwriting. I asked if it was hers. She looked at the notebook for a moment before she answered. Then she said the first part was her mother's. I waited. Her mother's name was Quina. Quina Harwick had kept a kitchen garden in Vermont for 30 years and had the particular stubbornness of a person who believes that difficult ground is only difficult until you understand it correctly. Blythe had grown up watching her fail with a clay patch in the back corner of their property for 4 years before Quina figured out what it needed, and what it needed was not better soil but a different question. Quina had started the Green Notebook in 2003, not from anything of her own, but from something Blythe had told her that a parcel of hillside land in Monroe County, Ohio, had come across her desk at the consulting firm, classified as non-productive with no rehabilitation potential, and that Blythe had written in the margin that the problem was hard pan, not the soil itself, and that her supervisor had crossed it out. Quina had never seen the Monroe County hillside. She had never been to Ohio in her life, but she had taken what Blythe described and begun writing down what she thought might be true about it in the same careful way she had kept notes on every piece of ground she had ever worked. What crop? What depth? What timing? What the freeze might do over a long enough period of winters. She had kept writing until she got sick. She had died in January of 2008. Blythe had read those pages after, and then she had written the next page herself, picking up where her mother left off in the page after that, and she had kept writing until the notebook contained the full plan for a hillside in Monroe County that two people had thought about together for years before either of them ever stood on it. The money she used to buy the land was Quina's. I held the green notebook in my hands for a moment after she told me that, not opening it, just holding it. There are things you handle differently once you know what they are. She took it back from me carefully the way she did everything. That spring, mid-May 2010, the first shoots came up. I saw them from my kitchen window on a Thursday morning, thin green lines following the contour of the hillside barely visible against the pale soil from a distance. They were exactly where they should have been, spaced the way the notebook said they should be spaced, running in the lines that the dibble bar had made the previous October on that cold Tuesday before first light. I stood at the window with my coffee going cold in my hand. That night, I saw that the light in Blythe's kitchen was still on at 11 o'clock. I know because I was up to check on a particular horse again, and I looked across out of habit. The light was on, not a bright working light, the low, warm kind that means someone is sitting at a table. I did not go over. There are things a person needs to sit with alone, and I had known enough of them myself to recognize one from the outside. 2 days later, I walked the fence line in the early afternoon and found her sitting on the flat stone again, not measuring, not reading. The black notebook was open on her knee this time, and she was writing but slowly in a way that was different from her usual fieldwork entries. I did not slow down. She did not look up. That evening, Lottie Mabry called me, and the first thing she said was not about Blythe. She said Lowell had driven past the hillside that afternoon and come home quieter than usual. She said she had asked him what he was thinking, and he had not answered right away. When he finally did answer, he had said he needed to make some calls. I asked her what kind of calls. She said land price calls. That Lowell had been checking with a real estate contact about current values for non-productive agricultural land in the county. I said I thought he had given that up. Lottie was quiet for a moment. He had, she said. He started again the day the shoots came up. The shoots meant the plan was working. The plan working meant Blythe was not going to fail and leave. Blythe not leaving meant the 41 acres along Callaway Creek was not going to come available at distressed land prices, which was what Lowell had been quietly waiting for since October of the previous year. I had not known that was what he was waiting for. I had suspected something, but I had not known. Lottie telling me directly was a different thing from suspecting. I did not say anything to Lowell about it. It was not something that required me to say anything, but it changed the way I understood his skepticism, which had always seemed to me to be about the land and the odds. It was also about the land and what it would be worth if he was right. He was not going to be right. By the end of June, the hardnecks were throwing up their scapes, those curling spirals of green that come up 6 weeks before harvest and tell you the plant is doing the thing it was put in the ground to do. I had seen garlic scapes before in Marion's kitchen garden, but I had never seen a hillside full of them, 40 degrees of slope covered in those green curves against the pale sky, moving slightly in the wind off the creek. I stood at the fence for a long time that morning. Harvest came in July. Blythe pulled bulbs from different rows and laid them side by side on the tailgate of her truck. I watched from a distance without meaning to intrude, and even from 50 feet away, the difference was visible. Some of the bulbs were tight and heavy, the kind of density that you can see before you pick them up, the papery skin pulled close against the cloves inside. Others were good, what you would expect from a first-year crop on reclaimed land. But the first kind were something else, and both of us knew it, though I was the only one watching, and I did not know yet what I was seeing. She set two of them on the tailgate, stood looking at them. Then she took a photograph with a small camera she kept in the truck cab. She put the photograph in the drawer beside the kitchen sink, the same drawer I found out later where she kept the page she had torn out of the company file 2 years earlier, the page with her supervisor's pen line through her handwritten note. In late July, she came to the farmer's market in town for the first time a Saturday morning, in the kind of summer heat that makes the asphalt in the parking lot soft underfoot. She set up a table without a sign and arranged the bulbs in rows by variety and put a handwritten card with the price in front of each row. Naylor walked over within the first 30 minutes. He supplied 12 grocery stores in the county, and he had the manner of a man who had correctly assessed the value of most things he had ever looked at. He examined the table. He told Blythe the presentation was good. He told her he could not move specialty product from an operation without refrigerated storage certification. Blythe told him hardneck garlic cured correctly does not require refrigeration, and that cold storage actually shortens its shelf life. Naylor looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. "I can't sell what I don't know how to store," he said. "I understand," Blythe said. She turned to the next customer. Naylor stood there for another 10 seconds. Then he walked away. He had come expecting either a sale or a negotiation, and she had given him neither. She had just told him the truth about the product, accepted that it was not his truth yet, and moved on. She sold out in 3 hours. By October, after the last of the harvest was gone and the orders she could not fill had been noted down, she opened the black notebook on the 3rd of November and wrote a single word. Then she drew a line under it twice. The word was underestimated, not as a condemnation, as a field measurement. 2 days later, a phone rang in her kitchen at 7:30 in the evening. A man from Columbus calling about garlic. He said he had driven the route before and was prepared to drive it again. I did not know about that call until the following morning when I saw a car I did not recognize parked in her gravel drive before I had finished my first cup of coffee. I stood at the window looking at it for a while. Then I went to the kitchen drawer and took out the letter from Agricor Partners. I read it again from the beginning, all the language about optimization and highest and best use assessments and 5-year partnership structures. Then I folded it along the original creases and tore it in half. I put both halves in the trash can under the sink and went back to my coffee. Some decisions do not announce themselves. They just become clear at a certain hour in the particular quality of morning light coming through a kitchen window, when you have been watching someone spend 2 years doing the hard invisible work that most people never see because it happens before dawn and in the frozen dark and in the margins of documents that nobody else thought to read. Dr. Burnett Quill had written 42 pages for the person who would need them. Quinna Harwick had written a green notebook for the hillside she would never see. Both of them had been right. I wanted to know what happened when the man from Columbus came out of that car and walked toward the woman who had been carrying all of that forward. The man who stepped out of the car in Blythe's gravel drive that November morning was exactly what I expected and nothing like what the moment required. Forsyth was 42 years old, and he carried himself with the particular ease of someone who had been right about things enough times in enough rooms that he had stopped anticipating being wrong. He wore a clean canvas jacket over a collared shirt. His shoes were wrong for gravel. He stood beside his car for a moment and looked at the hillside the way people look at something they have come a distance to evaluate, taking inventory rather than seeing cataloging, rather than understanding. I was watching from my kitchen window with a second cup of coffee going cold in my hand. He walked toward the farmhouse. Blythe came out to meet him on the front steps. She did not offer a tour. She did not make a speech. She reached into her jacket pocket, broke a single clove from a cured bulb she had been carrying, and handed it to him. He looked at it for a moment, then he ate it. What followed was close to a full minute of silence. Not awkward silence. Silence of the kind that happens when a person is reorganizing something inside themselves and has enough self-possession not to speak until the reorganization is complete. Forsyth stood in the gravel with the wind moving through the goldenrod along the creek bank, and he did not say anything for 50 seconds by my best estimate. When he finally spoke, he did not ask what variety it was. He did not ask what she had done differently. He asked how much she had. That was the question that told Blythe everything she needed to know about Forsyth, and it told her quickly. A man who asks how much you have before he asks what it costs has already done his calculation. He is not shopping. He is acquiring. She told him what she had. He was quiet again for a shorter period this time. Then he took out a spiral notebook from his jacket and wrote something on the top page and tore it off and handed it to her. It was a number, price per pound, not per bulb. Blythe folded the paper once and put it in her coat pocket without changing her expression. Forsyth watched her do this, and I think it was in that moment, watching her receive a number nearly 3 times the going rate for specialty garlic, without a flicker of visible reaction, that he understood he was not dealing with a person who needed what he was offering. He was dealing with a person who would decide whether what he was offering was worth accepting on terms that had nothing to do with gratitude. He asked whether she could commit to the same volume next season. She said she could commit to 500 bulbs, possibly more, if the fall planting went well, and that she would know more by November. He asked about exclusivity. He said he was prepared to offer a premium for first access, and that having her county on his menu had value he was willing to pay for. Blythe listened to all of it. Then she said she did not sell exclusivity. Forsyth looked at her. She said she sold good garlic to people who knew how to use it correctly. If he was that kind of person, he did not need exclusivity. If he was not, exclusivity would not make the garlic better. There was a pause of several seconds. Forsyth said, "Fair enough." They shook hands. No paperwork, no contract. Forsyth got back in his car and drove 2 hours and 40 minutes back to Columbus, which he had mentioned twice on the way in and did not mention at all on the way out. I watched his car reach the county road and turn south and disappear. Then I looked at the hillside. The rows were bare now, October harvested and mulched for winter. From a distance, the slope looked exactly as it had always looked, rocky, along the upper third pale clay. Through the middle section, the old terracing still visible if you knew where to look. The 3 dead apple trees at the southern edge had not changed. Everything that had happened on that hillside over the past 2 years was invisible from where I was standing. That was the thing about this kind of work. Most of it happened underground. Word moved through a county of 4,000 people faster than Blythe had anticipated. Within a week, she had 2 more calls. A restaurant in Cincinnati wanted to discuss a standing order, and Prentice called back from Pittsburgh as she had said she would. Prentice had first reached out in June before the harvest, asking technical questions about cure times and sulfur content that told Blythe immediately she was dealing with someone who understood the difference between a supplier and a source. Blythe had not had all the answers on that first call. She had driven to the county library, spent an afternoon with agricultural chemistry references, and called back 48 hours later with precise figures. Prentice had gone quiet on the line after that. Then she had said that no supplier she had ever worked with had called back with data. Blythe had said then you will have a baseline for comparison. Now Prentice was calling to place a real order. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. I knew about it because Blythe told me directly one afternoon when I came down to help check the fence line on the south edge of the property. She said Prentice had asked about growing conditions, curing humidity, and whether Blythe had ever considered shifting her harvest timing by a week in either direction to change the sharpness profile. I said that sounded like 2 people who both knew what they were talking about. Blythe said that was what had made it 40 minutes. She paused, looking at the fence wire she was holding. Then she said Prentice had told her something unexpected at the end of the call. Prentice said she had contacted 4 other hardneck garlic producers before Blythe, and all 4 had presented their product without mentioning a single limitation. Blythe was the only supplier who had volunteered unflattering information, specifically that the German red from the Eastern Terrace ran slightly hotter than she could guarantee consistent, and that any buyer who wanted predictable mild heat should know that up front. Blythe had said it because it was true. Prentice had said, "That is exactly why I am buying from you." By the end of October that year, every pound of garlic Blythe had to sell was spoken for, and there were orders she could not fill. Not because anything had gone wrong, because she had planted for the market she had projected, which was smaller than the market that had actually appeared. The confrontation with Lowell came in the second week of October, a Tuesday afternoon when the light was going flat and orange and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees since noon. I was at my fence line when Lowell pulled up in his truck, and I saw him looking at Blythe's gravel drive where Forsyth's car had been parked the previous week. He asked me whose car that had been. I told him it was a chef from Columbus. 2 hours and 40 minutes each way, mentioned twice on the way in. Lowell was quiet. He looked at the hillside that everyone in the county had spent 2 years calling worthless. The harvest rows were empty, cleaned the soil darker than it had been when Blythe first turned it. Not dramatically darker, but different enough that someone paying attention would notice. Lowell said I was wrong about the soil. He said it the way a man states something that cost him something to arrive at not as apology or drama, but as simple correction of the record. I did not say anything. Sometimes the right response to a hard-won admission is just to receive it. Lowell stood there another moment. Then he said that Lottie had been right, and he had been wasting time on the wrong calculation. He did not explain what calculation that was, but I knew and he knew I knew, and the silence between us covered it adequately. The next morning, he showed up at Blythe's gate with a coil of fence wire and asked if she needed help with the western section of the boundary, which had a post that had been leaning since August. Blythe came out, looked at the post, looked at Lowell, looked at the wire. She said, "Start from the corner." They worked 3 hours without talking about anything except the work. I watched from my side of the fence for a while and then went back to my own business because some things settle themselves better without a witness. That evening, I walked over to Blythe's for the first time since she had moved in at her invitation for coffee. She had mentioned it the previous week in passing, the way people mention things they mean, but are not making a formal occasion of. The kitchen was small and orderly. On the wall beside the window was a single sheet of paper pinned to a board, a photocopy with faded toner, and a diagram I recognized from the description Lottie had given me months earlier. The quill document, the 11-inch column circled in pencil. We sat at the table and she opened the green notebook and showed me the pages her mother had written. Quinna's handwriting was different from Blythe's, rounder and slower, the writing of someone who thought on paper rather than before touching pen to page. The entries read like working notes toward a theory, what the freeze might do, what root behavior might look like at depth, what the difference was between soil that was genuinely poor and soil that simply had not been asked the right question yet. The last page Quinna had written was dated 2005, 3 years before she died. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting that was slightly more deliberate than the entries above it, as though she had chosen the words carefully before writing them down, Quinna had written, "Blythe knows the right question. The rest is just time." I read those words twice. Then I set the notebook down on the table between us. Outside, the October evening was cooling the way it does in this county, fast and decisive, the temperature dropping 5 degrees in an hour. A line of starlings moved across the bottom of the sky, over my east field, and disappeared behind the tree line. I told Blythe about my father and the east field drainage work. I had told that story before to different people in different forms. But telling it in that kitchen, with the green notebook on the table, and the quill diagram on the wall, and the empty hillside outside the window, it landed differently than it ever had. My father had waited on certainty. Quinna Harwick had been building certainty for a hillside she would never see, writing the conclusion at the bottom of the page before she ran out of time to write more. Blythe listened without speaking. Then she said her mother had never been wrong about ground. She said Quinna had a capacity for attention that most people reserved for things they could see the immediate point of, and she had applied it to everything, including a piece of hillside in Ohio that she had only ever known through her daughter's description. I asked Blythe if she thought Quinna had known what she was doing when she wrote that last line. She said she thought Quinna had known exactly what she was doing. She said her mother had been practical about most things, and the green notebook was no exception. Quinna had understood that she was not going to finish what she had started, and so she had written the conclusion first, so that wherever Blythe was when she read it, She would know that the conclusion had already been reached, and the only thing left was the doing. I picked up the notebook again and looked at the last page. The handwriting was careful. The ink had not faded the way older pages had. She had written it to last. Crandall came to the farm in December unannounced, which was not his style. He parked on the gravel and sat in his car for a moment before getting out. And when he did get out, he was carrying a manila envelope. He handed it to Blythe without a long introduction. He said Winona had thought she should have what was inside and that he agreed with Winona. Inside was a photocopy of the title page of the Quill document, the extension office's own copy, and a handwritten list of 4 other historical bulletins from the same storage box that touched on related subjects. Clay soil reclamation, freeze-thaw effects on compaction layers in the Ohio River watershed, root behavior of perennial alliums in difficult substrates. Blythe looked at the list. She asked if Crandall had read them. He said he had read all of them over the past 2 months. She asked what he thought. He was quiet for a moment, in the particular way of a man choosing words more carefully than usual. He said he thought Dr. Quill had been better at his job than Crandall had given him credit for. He said he thought Blythe had asked better questions than he had answered. That was all he said. He shook her hand and drove back to the extension office. A week later, Winona called Blythe to let her know that Crandall had submitted a formal proposal to the Extension Service to digitize and preserve the historical soil bulletins in county storage across the region. The proposal cited the Callaway Creek hillside as a working example of the practical value of that documentation. The proposal had been approved. The bulletins Dr. Quill had written for people he would never meet were going to be available now to every person in the state who looked for them. Crandall had done that. He had done it without announcement and without ever suggesting to anyone that his thinking had changed, because changed thinking does not require speech. It requires action. January came and Blythe ordered 200 more bulbs. Music again and 40 of the German red, because Forsyth had asked carefully in a follow-up call whether she had ever considered a hardneck with more complex heat. She had not been considering it when he asked. She was considering it now. The bulbs arrived in late February in a cardboard box, which she took down to the root cellar and set on a shelf in the cool dark, the same way things that are not yet ready wait until the season tells them they are. She walked to the hillside the first week of January, which was her practice now for the 3rd year running, using wooden stakes and orange survey tape to mark where she thought another 150 feet of row could go without exceeding what one person could manage alone. She moved along the slope, measuring with her feet and her tape, and her memory of what the previous 2 growing seasons had taught her about where on this hillside the ground gave the most and where it needed the most given back to it. She was not expanding because she had orders to fill. She was expanding at exactly the rate she could sustain without compromising what had made the first harvest worth driving 2 hours and 40 minutes to taste. In March, she walked out one morning with a stick she used to probe the soil near the top of the slope, and the stick went in 4 inches without resistance. She was back down at the gate with the first flat of German red by 8 o'clock. I was at the fence when she came up the hill carrying the tray. She was moving quickly, not rushing, but with the contained energy of someone for whom the ground's readiness on a specific morning is not a small thing. I had a question I had been holding for a while. I asked it, then partly because the moment felt right, and partly because I had run out of reasons to keep waiting. I asked her whether she had known when she wrote that margin note in the company file in 2007 that she was going to end up here. She set the tray down on the upper terrace and looked at me. She said she had not known she was going to end up here. She had only known that the note was correct and that it had been crossed out, and that those 2 facts together created a problem she could not leave alone. She said the land had not called to her in any romantic sense. She said she had looked at a set of data about a piece of ground and seen that the conclusion drawn from that data was wrong, and wrong in a specific correctable way, and that had been enough. I asked her if she ever thought about what would have happened if her supervisor had not crossed out the note. She thought about that seriously, the way she thought about most things without performing consideration. She said she thought about it sometimes. She said she thought maybe she would have written a better assessment and the client might have bought the land and done something conventional with it, and the hillside would have sat there being farmed in the way that had failed it twice before. She said she thought her mother's notebook might have stayed in a drawer. Then she picked up the tray of German red and started up the eastern third of the slope, where the morning light came first and stayed longest. The harvest that August came to 912 heads total, Music and German red combined. Blythe graded them on the porch table on a Wednesday afternoon in the kind of light that makes everything look like a painting of itself. She kept 12 heads of German red back for seed stock. Everything else went into brown paper bags with her handwritten label, the name of the variety, the county, the year. Lottie Mabry came over that afternoon and sat on the porch step and watched without being asked to help, which was the right instinct. Watching someone do the work they have spent years learning to do is not nothing. It is a form of witness that the person doing the work feels without necessarily acknowledging. After a while, Lottie said that Lowell had asked her the previous week whether Blythe took students. Blythe set down the bulb she was holding and looked at Lottie. Lottie said she had not given Lowell an answer. She said she had told him that was a question he should ask himself. Blythe looked at the hillside for a moment. Then she went back to grading. The following week, Lowell Mabry came to the gate alone on a Tuesday morning with his cap in his hands and asked if Blythe would be willing to teach him what she knew about difficult ground. Blythe told me about it that evening the way she sometimes did when she had decided something was worth the telling. Lowell had stood at the gate and asked his question, and then weighted his cap, turning slowly in both hands in the way of a man who has spent 2 years being wrong about something and has finally decided that the cost of staying wrong is higher than the cost of admitting it. Blythe had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had opened the gate. She had said there was a section of the North Terrace that needed another set of hands to get the spacing right before the October planting window closed, and that if he wanted to start there, she would show him what she was looking for. Lowell had put his cap back on and followed her up the hillside. That was all. No speech, no ceremony. Two people going up a slope that one of them had spent 2 years dismissing, and the other had spent 2 years transforming to do work that needed doing before the ground got too cold. October arrived, and with it, the fourth planting season on that hillside. I was at the fence post again on the third Tuesday of the month, same position I had been standing in the first time I saw the headlamp moving across the slope in the dark 4 years earlier. The thermos in my hand was the same one that had belonged to my father. Lowell Mabry was standing beside me. It was the first time we had stood at that fence together, both of us looking down at the same ground without arguing about it. Below us, Blythe was working her way across the first terrace with the dibble bar, the same motion she had always used, the same pace, the same silence. The soil under her feet was visibly darker than the gray-tan clay I had watched her turn over that first October. 3 years of roots breaking down, 3 years of mulch working into the surface, 3 years of something living and dying in the same place long enough to leave a trace. It would not look like much to someone who had not seen them before. But I had seen them before. Lowell said, "You going to go down?" I said I was going to give her another 10 minutes to get settled in the row. He nodded. He understood the etiquette now. You do not interrupt a person who is working at the pace that work requires. We stood there, the two of us, in the October cold with our breath making small clouds in the air, watching a woman plant garlic on a hillside that 3 families and 1 county assessor and 1 extension agronomist and 2 skeptical neighbors had called finished. I thought about Marcus Webb at AgriCorp Partners and his language about optimization and highest and best use. I thought about what highest and best use actually meant, and whether it had anything to do with what you could extract from a piece of ground in a 5-year investment window, or whether it had more to do with what happened when someone paid enough attention for long enough to understand what the ground was actually capable of. I thought about Dr. Burnett Quill, who had left his work in a cardboard box for 38 years, trusting that it would find whoever needed it. I thought about Quina Harwick writing in a green notebook for a hillside she would never stand on, working out conclusions from a description her daughter had brought home from a job, writing the ending before she ran out of time to write more. And I thought about Blythe, who had been given a crossed-out margin note and a dead woman's notebook in a 41-acre hillside that everyone else had finished with, and who had looked at all of it and seen not an obstacle, but a question that had simply not been answered correctly yet. There is a kind of patience that most people call stubbornness because they cannot see the difference from the outside. And there is a kind of certainty that most people call arrogance for the same reason. Blythe Harwick had both, and from where I stood at that fence post on that October morning, having watched the whole of it from beginning to where it had gotten to, neither word came close. Lowell finally started down toward the gate. He had told Blythe he would be there by 8, and it was a few minutes past. I stayed at the fence a little longer. The rows below me were taking shape now, Dark marks in the pale soil running parallel across the face of the hillside in the lines she had marked with her stakes and tape in January. In 8 months, they would be thick green lines moving in the wind off Callaway Creek, and in 10 months, they would be harvest. And the season after that, and the season after that. Some things take longer than a year to prove themselves. Some things take longer than 2 years or three or whatever amount of time the ground requires, which is not a schedule that can be negotiated with or optimized or managed by anyone who has not first learned to listen to what the ground is actually saying. The neighbors who had stopped laughing and started asking questions, she answered every one of them. I had watched her do it over the fence and over coffee and in the particular currency of work done beside each other without too many words. That was its own kind of generosity, the willingness to share not the outcome, but the method to let people see that the method was available to anyone willing to pay the cost of it, which was mostly time and attention and the discipline not to move until you understood what you were looking at. I finished my coffee, the thermos my father had carried, the fence post he had set. I looked at the hillside one more time, and then I went to start my own morning. If you have a hillside someone told you was finished, I want to hear about it.